Lots more people coming in. Admitting those now. Right, it's 10 o'clock, so we will get started, and I will be letting people in as we go, but we'll get started on time. Okay. So, hello and welcome everybody to this webinar on creating a professional podcast. It's part of our Autumn Winter at Home Festival, which is a 9-week programme of events, and it runs until the 10th of December. This event is free to members, but if you can afford to donate, please consider a small amount to the author's contingency fund, which is helping those hardest hit by the impact of this health pandemic. I will put the link in the chat box shortly. This session is hosted by Pete Morgan, and Pete has spent the last 30 years working in local, regional and national radio. He's an award-winning presenter and producer. In 2017, he decided to move into the world of podcasting with his business, Monkey Pants Productions, and I've come appropriately prepared, Pete.
Nice.
So, yeah, I'm on theme here. And now Monkey Pants Productions is one of the premier names in podcasting in the West Midlands. So I shall hand over to Pete. Before I do, most of you will know the drill by now that we put our questions into the chat box, and the session will run for 90 minutes, so we will be having a comfort break halfway through. We'll get to questions at the end, but just keep typing them in and we'll pick them up in turn as we get to them. And now I shall hand over to Pete, and he's going to take you through the podcasting process from planning and recording through to publishing, marketing, and even a bit about monetization, I think.
Yeah.
Over to you, Pete.
Absolutely, Anna. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me along today. As Anna said, radio producer and presenter for 30 years, worked all over the UK. A couple of questions that I normally get asked. Most famous person I ever met was was Paul McCartney, who was very nice, and the worst celebrity or the most annoying celebrity I ever met was Will Young, but I just think he was having a bit of a bad day. And then I've been a fan of podcasts probably since about 2015, 2016, and just fell in love with them, and then decided that I wanted to help other people fall in love with them as well in 2017. And one of the questions that I still get even now is why podcasts? Why should I put myself in a podcast in a professional way, whether it's a hobby that you're putting into your podcast or whether it is your business that you're putting into your podcast? From the business point of view, from a professional point of view, you can establish yourself as an expert in your field, because who do you trust more? The person who does a YouTube video every 2 months, or the person who creates original, informative, valuable, entertaining podcast content that is generally taken on board and listened to when it's one-on-one? Listening to podcasts is not a group activity. It's something you do on your own. It's incredibly intimate, that connection that you make with a podcast listener. And people listen to podcasts at intimate times. So when it's just them and maybe the dog, when they're in the car, when they're in bed at night. That's one of the reasons to podcast. And you can start that intimate relationship with your listeners. The relationship I always kind of compare it to is when we were younger, there would have been, for most of us, a breakfast show presenter on the radio that we would have attached ourselves to. And depending on your age, it could be Simon Mayo on Radio 1, it could be Chris Evans on Radio 1, it could be Terry Wogan on Radio 2, it could be Tony Blackburn on Radio 1. Whatever it was, they were your friend and you were connected to them. And you felt, if you'd have met them in the street, you would have greeted them as a friend, even though they didn't know who you were. That's what it is to be a podcaster and a podcast listener. It also gives you a chance to enlarge your digital presence. It's a way of repurposing content. So if you do a blog on a regular basis, why not make that blog out loud? And then you created a podcast. It also means I get to know you in a different way, which again is a very powerful thing. You have a a skill, you have ideas, you have a passion that other people want access to, want knowledge about. And why not share it with your own great personality that will come across naturally as you get more and more into podcasting? So we're going to start off and talk about equipment. Now, there's a couple of things that Anna's going to send you in an email afterwards, which details some of the equipment, gives you like a plan. And also, one thing I meant to ask Anna is this recording? Are people going to get the chance to view this again? Yeah.
It is recording. If you are happy for people to view it again, then yes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's perfect. It's just because I don't want people to feel that they've constantly got to be making notes. It's good if there's like, okay, well, I could just sit back and enjoy it for what it is, and then I can go back and go, okay, I shouldn't make a bit more notice about that. So to make a professional sounding podcast, all you need are 4 things, and that is it. And people always say, oh, you know what? You can make a podcast just using your phone. And you can. There's an app you can get called Anchor. Anchor are increasingly becoming a big player in the world of podcasting. And you can make it on your phone, from your phone, add music on your phone, and we'll get to music a little bit later on, and publish it from your phone. But to do that, to do a podcast through your phone is, personally, I don't think it's good. I think it's like doing a website that looks like that. Now, if you had a website that why would anyone have a website that looks like that? Why would you make a podcast on your phone? Making a podcast on your phone, it sounds like one thing and one thing only, that you've made a podcast on your phone. So I would advise against it. The first thing you need is your microphone. It's the single most important piece of equipment that you'll buy. It is the biggest and the best investment you will make when it comes to making a podcast. And one of the things about microphones is that people don't know they've got a good microphone until they hear a bad one. People don't know the power of the microphone until they hear a bad microphone. So at the moment, I'm using this microphone to speak to you. I'm using this thing, which I realise, looks like a member of the Jackson 5 from the 60s. But this is actually a thing. This is called a Chaotica eyeball. This is soundproofing for my microphone. My actual microphone, I don't know if you can see, is in there. And it's an Audio Technica microphone, cost about £80. But it gives a good sound, and you can hear me pretty clearly. But if I just change my microphone to the built-in microphone in my desktop, which I've done now, and you should be able to hear that there's a difference in quality. It sounds rough, and that's just because the microphone's just not good enough. I'm going to turn it back because I know if I it makes me sad. So the microphone is integral. There's 2 types of microphones you can get, and this is where, as I say, it can get a little bit kind of technical. There's 2 microphones you can get. There's the USB microphone. So we all know USB connectors. Hopefully that's a USB connector. And there's a thing called an XLR microphone, which is those kind of connectors that you will see. If you get an XLR microphone, you need to buy another piece of equipment, which is called an audio interface. And again, examples of these are going to be in the thing you'll be sent by Anna in the email. Catherine's asked, that she's got a Blue Yeti for audiobook narration. How's that for a podcast? Blue Yetis are a great microphone. They just need to be used correctly, which again, we're going to get onto a little bit later on. Your microphone technique and your microphone placement can really make the difference between a great sounding podcast and a podcast that sounds like you've recorded it in a hangar. So kind of, yeah, of course I can turn my volume up. Is that better? volume's up a little bit more. There we go. So, done. Yes. Okay. So and people will ask, so how much should I spend on a microphone? Like with anything, even more so with microphones, you absolutely get what you pay for. You might find a microphone that costs a £5 down at the market. You are going to hear every penny of that microphone on your podcast, and not in a good way. You need to probably spend about £100, certainly no more than £200. If you're spending more than £200 on a microphone, there's some really good microphones you can get for about 250. But a Blue Yeti's good. That costs about 120. The Rode Pod mic or the Rode NT USB, again, that's in the document you'll get in the email. They're both about £100, £120. They're all available on Amazon. They're available on another website called Gears for Music. It's the number 4. Or you can go straight to the manufacturer's site. And if they don't sell it on the site, they point you to a seller that does, if you don't want to use Amazon. And I understand that various people don't really like doing it. Linda's asking, is recording on the phone? And no. Yeah. The internal mic just isn't good enough to create a professional sounding podcast. What it creates is a phone call. It just doesn't have the quality that I would want you to have on a podcast. And there's some people who are going to be more than happy with the quality that comes off the phone. And if that's you, then that's fine. But I personally don't like it. There is a mic you can plug in. There's various ones. I mentioned Rode. Again, I'm not sponsored by Rode. I'm not affiliated with Rode microphones. I've just used Rode quite a lot, and I find them very good. And they have one called the video mic, and it has a connector that you plug into the bottom of your phone, but you have to download a Rode app to record on your phone. You record it into the Rode app and then migrate it out to your phone if that's the way you want to do it. Margaret asking, does a proper mic block out extraneous noise? Well, this is what I'm going to get to mic technique in a little bit, because the microphone, they're not magic. Microphones are just a device, just like everything else. So other pieces of equipment, microphone, absolutely, you need it. Headphones is the next one. Not wearing headphones whilst you're recording a podcast or whilst you're initially setting up your microphone and equipment is kind of like driving with a blindfold on, because how can you hear if the recording sounds okay? How can you hear if your guest sounds okay? You need a pair of headphones. Sony, AKG do some good ones that are about £20. What you want is a headphone, and I'm not saying you do not need to buy. These are Beats that were a gift for me a few years ago, but you want a headphone that has a proper thing that actually goes onto your ear. So don't use earbuds, again, because the speaker's pretty small in an earbud, and you really want to hear what's going on. So you want those that kind of go over your ears, ideally. If all you've got is other headphones that lie flat on your ears, it's okay. But the ones that go over your ears, they're going to cut out as much of the background noise as possible to give you the best idea as to what's being recorded and the quality of the sound that's being recorded. So headphones is the next one. A recorder. Now, some people will just use a handheld recorder to record everything. Some people use their laptop to record their podcast on. I use my desktop if I'm working from home that I'm talking to you on now. I've got an example of a couple of recorders. I have a Tascam DR40. These are about couple of £100. These are very good quality. And both of these that I'm going to show you are solid state recorders. So there's no moving parts. There's no little tape you put in it. But the Tascam is one, and it has its own microphones that can either be flipped out or flipped in, depending on where you're recording. Can I use my Bose noise cancelling headphones? Absolutely. Yeah, because they go over your ears. They are going to be good at keeping out the noise, just so you can hear. And some people don't feel comfortable using them whilst they're recording. They like to kind of go, yeah, okay, everything's set up. That's what you need to do. You need to think, you know, I need to be able to hear properly, that I can be heard on the recording through the microphone, and that my guest can as well. What about Dave Clark flying headsets? Headsets are okay, because the microphones in headsets are actually quite good at dealing with background noise. And I think if you're just starting out, use them. But if you're going to do a podcast for a long time, I would look at investing in a microphone, because you're going to want a better quality setup in the end. I'm going to talk about recording on location, and indeed, Emma, that's what these things can be used for, is recording on location. Some people just use these to record their own podcast, but they can be used if you're going out in the field as well. With anything, if you get, this is a Marantz one, BBC reporters. I worked for the BBC for 10 years and I use one of these. This isn't a BBC one. I didn't slip it in my jacket pocket as I was walking out one day. I bought this separately. These are quite expensive. This was about £350, but it's because the recording quality on this is excellent. I used to do a podcast about my dogs, and they and I went to Crufts at the NEC, and the NEC, as you know, is just a series of hangars that you're in, and I recorded quite a bit of my podcast from there, and the sound quality was excellent. You could hear there was noise in the background, but my voice came through really, really well. So both of these are solid state. The thing you need, I mean, the Tascam ones has got XLR connectors at the bottom, so you could plug external mics in. The Marantz doesn't have that. It really is just recording through these two microphones here. But whatever handhold you get, Zoom is another one as well. Yeah, Irene's, well, you may well have been putting Zoom for the thing that we're on now, but Zoom do very good handheld recorders as well. The one thing you need to check that each of them has is a thing there, USB. You need the USB port on your machine or on your recorder, because you need to get the audio off this and onto your computer. Because if you don't buy a dictaphone, because it doesn't come off a dictaphone, it stays on the dictaphone. So you need that. And so that's a Tascam DR40, and that is a Marantz PMD 620 are those two that I use. But Zoom do some very good ones as well. And again, the Zoom ones are probably about between 80 and 150 pounds. And the Marantz one was the BBC one. So the recorder is invaluable if you want to use your laptop. So if I go out and record with a client, I always use my laptop, and there's a couple of programs that you can use. One of them is Adobe Audition. So I have the Adobe Audition Creative Suite, which is about, depending on the deal you can get, is about 50, 60 pounds a month, which obviously is a big of a stretch for a lot of people. I have it because it's my business, but it means I get access to Photoshop and Premiere Pro and Spark and everything else that Adobe do. And at the other end is a program called Audacity. And Audacity is brilliant. It is free. It always has been free. It always will be free. Audacity.org is where you will find it, or teamaudacity.org as well. You go there, you download it for your machine, and that's what you record into. So ideally, you'll be getting a USB microphone and plugging the USB microphone into your laptop. If you've got 2 USB microphones, you can't just plug both USB microphones into your laptop, because that confuses computers, because they don't know which to prioritize. So if you've got 2 USB microphones, if you're wanting it to be you and a guest, you're going to need your best getting XLR microphones, which are the other connectors, and an audio interface that then goes into your laptop. So you'll probably have to come back and watch that a little bit, because I don't want to get too technical. If you've got a Mac, then you've got a really good recording program and editing program already on your laptop, and that is Garageband. It's a program that's, if it's not on your laptop but you have a Mac, it'll be free. You can download it, and you just tell it what your input is, and you just start recording, and it's as simple as that. That's incredibly easy to use. So a microphone, headphones, a recorder, and an editing program, Adobe or Audacity, those are the 4 things that you need to start your podcast. When you're doing a recording, make sure you do a test. Please, please don't do what I've had happen to me, and I've made the mistake of doing it myself, that the first time I've used a piece of equipment is either when I'm recording my first episode or when I'm speaking to my first guest. Because to have someone, I get very embarrassed, and I'm like, oh, it's not working. Just bear with me one second, Mr. President, while I just try and sort this out. Just do a test. Speak to yourself, speak to the dog, however you want to do it, but use the equipment before you actually have to use the equipment. Obviously, there's a lot of remote recording that goes on as well at the moment. All of my clients are still able to carry on making their podcasts, which are interviewing guests and doing panels and things like that. A couple of ways of doing it. I use Skype for some of my guests, which is very old school, but I have a program called the Ecamm Skype Recorder, which there is a Windows version, but that is a Mac version, and that records the call, just records the audio of the call between the 2 of you. There's a website as well called Zencaster, and Zencaster is basically ZENCASTR, so no E at the end. And that is like an audio version of Zoom. You create a session, you send out an invite link, and people can just join this and you can record it. But some people still like to do the Zoom thing. They like to see people and, feel like they're actually talking to a person. If you are doing remote recording and you are doing Zoom, a couple of things I want you to be mindful of. Ideally, your guest should have an external microphone as well, because you want them to be in good quality. Now, I've got some podcasters that will plan far enough in advance that guest can buy an external microphone. I have some podcasters who have like 2 loan out mics that they post out to guests and then post them back. It doesn't always work because you've got to put a lot of trust in the postal service and there's a cost involved in it, but they feel it's worth it to make sure that both sides of the conversation is in quality. And that's the thing you've always got to be thinking of, is what's the quality of the sound? Because it's great doing it on Zoom because you can see the person, but if the other person has got Zoom on their phone and they're on the top of Ben Nevis, then the signal's going to keep dropping out, the quality is going to be really poor, and you could have the best guest in the world, but people aren't going to stick with that. And this is, again, one of the examples that I give is if you're driving in the car and you're listening to an FM radio, remember those, and your favorite song in the world comes on, but you're just at the edge of the transmission area for that radio station. So it starts getting a bit fuzzy and the quality really drops. you don't stick with it. You just switch to the next station. And that's your favorite song in the world. So imagine what a podcast listener is going to do who isn't a friend of yours or a member of your family if the quality of your audio isn't good. They're not going to stay listening. They're not going to stick with you. Doesn't matter what a great guest you've got. Doesn't matter what brilliant new content you've got. If the quality of the audio isn't good, thankfully podcast listeners have become a lot more understanding during the pandemic. They get it. People can't get to studios. They can't sit face to face. Sometimes the quality does drop, but it's just keeping that in mind and bearing that in mind. StreamYard for guests, like a live event. Absolutely. The thing you then need to think about is the location of your microphone. So microphones are not magic. It is a device, and all it's doing is taking in all of the noise. So as well as taking my voice in at the moment, it's also taking this clapping in. And it doesn't differentiate between the two. It doesn't go, okay, that's Pete speaking and Pete clapping. So if you come too far away from the microphone now, if I went very far away, it would hear my voice, it would hear the echo of my voice, it would hear the room atmos, and so the quality of the recording drops down. The ideal distance from a microphone, and I'll demonstrate it with this, is what we call the thumbs up technique. So you get your thumbs up and you put the base of your thumb on the tip of the microphone, and then you put the tip of your thumb on your bottom lip. That is the optimum distance for you to speak into a microphone. Now, when you are speaking into a microphone, and all recorders will have it, and if you use Audacity, that will have it as well, you'll see the meter telling you how loud you are. And it's done on the recorders. It's generally just one light that comes up red, but on Audacity, and indeed most recorders, it's a traffic light system. Green is good, amber is okay, red is please stop talking and turn down your microphone. One thing you can do with audio is, if you're a little bit quiet, you can make it louder. One thing you cannot do with audio is get rid of distortion. If you've distorted on the recording, there's no trick in the book to get rid of it. That distortion is there. So again, this is why you do a test, working out your levels. Garageband does have a traffic light system. Yeah, you can see the monitors there. Ideally, you're looking for green, a bit of yellow, and occasionally, if you kind of went ha, 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 and laugh like that, it might just bump into the red. That's fine. What you don't want is that constant into the red all the time, because what that means when you look at a sound wave is it's going to be up to the top of the graph and flattening out as it distorts. So that there. And when you're recording, if you're going to be recording at home and just recording yourself, do it in the smallest room in the house if you can. I have recorded underneath duvets. That myth is true. It works, because what you've got to think about is the sound is coming out of my mouth. The other thing I'm not doing, which you should be doing, and in fact I will move it across so it's do as I do as well as do what I say. The microphone should be in front of you. So as the voice is coming out of you, it's hitting the microphone. Now, obviously not all of the voice is hitting the microphone, because you're not speaking to it like that. So my voice is going past the microphone. It's hitting this monitor, which you're all on, and coming back to the microphone. It's hitting, I've got a plastered wall here. It's hitting that and coming back to the microphone. And that's why they say don't record in the bathroom, because all the sound does is bounce around and move around. So the microphone is taking in your voice, and then another quick echo, and then another quick echo, and then another quick echo. And it just sounds uncomfortable. So you get kind of close at the thumbs up. And the reason I don't set a thumbs up distance is I've been using microphones for 30 years and I've got quite a big mouth. And it's as simple as that. And in time, you might think, actually, yeah, no, this seems right for my tone of voice. But I always go start with that, and then you find your comfort. Because for some people, they may want to get really close. If they're particularly softly spoken, they might want to get very, very close to the mic. And that's fine. It is finding your comfortable place with the microphone. When we come back, I'm going to talk about presenting tips and some presentation stuff a little bit later. And we'll talk a little bit more about microphones. I want to talk about music as well. If you use music in your podcast, it must be licensed or it must be copyright free. There is huge debates going on at the moment regarding podcasting and music. And it's because it's a global product. You might think, well, my mate's a guitarist, and he's had a couple of albums out. You know, they're on Spotify. I'm sure I could use one of them. Okay, unless you've got permission from the publisher, and it has to be the publisher because they're the people that are worried about the amount of money not going into their pockets. You don't have permission to use it. Get something in writing. It's not enough to have a text off your friends and say, yeah, of course you can use it. It's one of my favorites. Thankfully, there's some really good copyright-free sites out there. There's audiojungle.net, where a piece of music can cost you maybe $10, $20, as much as maybe $40, but that price gives you a license so you can use it on your podcast as well. And some people don't want music in their podcast. And I'll be honest, I can't understand that, because music is the means by which people recognize so much. Again, it really enforces that emotional tie, that neural tie with something. So if I just go, and again, this will depend on everybody's age, but if I go, wow, 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 dum, dum, digga, dum, that's what, 3 seconds. You knew what the show was. You either knew it was Grange Hill or it was one of the early series of the game show Give Us a Clue, because they use the same music, bit of TV trivia there for you. Similarly, if I do, I don't need to do anything more. You know the soap. You know it's just sad people living in a very small space in London who never have a good Christmas. That's what that is. And similarly, if I just do, dun, that's 2 notes and you know what it is. That's how effective music is. And the theme music for podcast comes in many forms, and I've got some examples here. So I'm going to just share. Advanced. I am sharing music. So this is a heavily produced one, which I think should come up. Just let me know if you can hear this. Wait 1 second. It's not playing yet, so let me get rid of that. See, this is where rehearsal works. You hear that? Welcome to the Online Marketing Made Easy podcast. Business advice so easy, you'll feel like you're cheating. And now your host, Amy Porterfield. Okay, that's incredibly heavily produced music. There is one that's produced by your mates. One of my favorite podcasts is No Such Thing as a Fish. This theme tune, which is basically the guys that write the questions for QI. This is their theme tune, and this was composed by a friend of the show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of No Such Thing as a Fish, a weekly podcast.
One of the biggest podcasts in the world. So big, they've toured 4 times and done sellout tours. I've been to every tour. So there's that one, and they got obviously written permission. And somebody else said, do you have to acknowledge music permission in your podcast? If you've been to somewhere like Audio Jungle and bought the license, no, you don't. It's completely up to you. If a friend of yours has written it and you've got your permission from the publisher and you want to say the music's by my friend, you know, Bobby McHooey, who's brilliant, then that's great. That's fine. And that's just a nice thing for them. But if you've already paid for the license, no, you don't. With an audiobook, where would the music go? You see, that is more of a taste and editorial decision as to whether you put music in your audiobook. If it tallies with the story that you're telling and has a place, then fine. But generally, audiobook music is right at the very, very beginning as part of the introduction, and again, right at the very, very end. And then, so it kind of dovetails it. And similarly with your podcast, some people just have music at the beginning, don't have any at the end. Some have it at the beginning and the end. Some have it at the beginning and then in different places to kind of separate sections of the show out. This is a soundscape theme tune, so there's no music particularly.
Oh, wait, you're listening.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
You're
Listening
to Radio Lab.
Radio Lab.
From
WNYC. Yep.
So, again, one of my favorite podcasts. Heartily recommend listening to it. Different stories every week. And it's done by the public radio guys in New York. And then there's the final one that you've composed and recorded yourself. This is Adam Buxton, again, as one of my favorite podcasters. This is his theme tune.
I added one more podcast to the giant podcast bin. Now you have plucked that podcast out and started listening. I took my microphone and found some human folk. Then I recorded all the noises while we spoke. My name is Adam Buxton, I'm a man. I want you to enjoy this, that's the plan.
So there we go. Those are the different types of theme tunes that you can have. When it comes to actually planning, and one of the things that you're going to get in the email is a template for planning out your podcast episode. And again, the beauty is with podcasting is there is no hard or fast rules. There's no Ofcom for podcasting. There's just the different podcasting platforms. And as long as you're not practicing hate speech or threatening to overthrow a government, you can talk about whatever you like in your podcasts. So the guide that I've passed on to Anna just kind of divides it up and talks about, where music might go, where sponsorship might go, and you can have a look about that. You absolutely should plan before you start. Start quick, don't plan too much, but make sure you have some kind of idea about, okay, what's going to happen in this episode. Loosely script what you're going to say, rather than, because if you write it all completely down and then read it out, as you know, it's difficult for people to make that differentiation between the written voice and the speaking voice unless you're writing speech. But if you're just writing for yourself, it can sound stilted when you're reading it out. Whereas if you loosely script it, bullet point it, whatever feels natural to you, that's what you should be doing. Have an arc for the episode. Know where it's going, what you're going to be covering. Have a proper intro and outro to your episode as well. The thing I always learned from doing radio is we were told, I mainly did breakfast shows, which is why I look like this. I kept getting up at 3:30 in the morning. I'm only 21. The thing we were always told is you get a new audience every 20 minutes. So every 20 minutes, you need to tell people who you are, tell people what the show's about. Not explicitly, but they can't feel like they're walking into the party late. And similarly, you have to do that with your podcast. The intro should be the same for episode 64 as it was for episode 1. Who are you? What is this podcast about? What are you going to be dealing with? Because I've maybe come to this because a friend recommended it. I need to know what I'm going to be getting. Listeners love spontaneity, but they don't like surprises. If you've got a call to action, mention that at the beginning of your podcast. Mention it briefly. So if your call to action is go and look at my website, for instance, say, and if you're interested to find out more about what I do, I'm going to give you some details at the end. Don't wait too long. Don't have too much before you get to the meat of the action. Go into detail at the end, because if they've waited till the end, they're interested in you. And they're interested in what you've got to say and finding out more about you. I want to do a quick exercise regarding interviews. And Anna is going to help me with this. And I just want to illustrate some of the bad guests that you can get on a podcast, and that I've had either when I've been recording my podcasts or when I worked for the BBC and I interviewed hundreds of people over the time. And I feel terrible now because people come up and go, oh, you interviewed me in 2014. We talked about cabbage crops. I was like, right. No idea. I've had a sleep since we last met. So Anna, you're going to ask me 4 questions, and I'm going to give 4 different answers to illustrate bad guests. The first question, what's the first question?
So Pete, you've already told us what your favourite podcast is. Who's doing it best at the moment? Who's making the best podcasts at the moment?
Who is making the best podcast at the moment? The best podcast at the moment is probably being made by, I would say, Prsc. They're a production house out in America, predominantly based on the West Coast. And there's a team of about 12, 15 people, excellent audio engineers, some of the EQ that they can apply, and some of the production sweeps that they do to some of the episodes are absolutely superb. What that was an example of is a literal response, because you're after who's a good podcast host, who's actually doing a good podcast host. In reality, the proper answer is a guy in Britain. There's a woman called Helen Zaltzman, who is wonderful. She had a podcast called The Allusionist, which I highly recommend. And in America, there's a guy called Roman Mars, who does a superb podcast. He does 2, one called 99% Invisible, and the other one is What Donald Trump Can Teach Us About Con Law, which is incredibly informative. So literal responses. And so you need to think, when you're writing your questions down, you need to think, what answer am I going to get? What answer do I want? What question should I ask to get that response? Next question, Anna.
No pressure. What is the longest running podcast series?
I don't know. That is the worst type of guest. Particularly when I worked on radio, you had 4 minutes to fill. And if you had a guest that was giving answers like, I'm not sure, or the correct answer is How Stuff Works. How Stuff Works is the longest running podcast series. And at one time, before Joe Rogan came along, was the biggest podcast in the world. Always make sure that your questions are open. Don't allow for yes, no answers. Make sure that there's a bit of, and if someone does give a yes, no answer, just ask for more information. Just tell us a little bit more about that. Joe, lovely to see you. Thank you for coming. Take care. Third question.
So who has been your best guest and why?
I think my best guest that I've ever had would probably be, it's probably, I mean, thinking about it now, because there's been lots of politicians that I've spoken to. There's been some musicians, there's been celebrities, there has been people, you know, what some people would refer to as ordinary people, general listeners who you would speak to, and they all had stories to tell. I think I would have to say, one of the things I always think about when I come to an interview with a guest is I think about how we're going to connect, and is there anything we can bond over? Okay, I've been talking for about 30, 40 seconds, and I've not even started to answer your question yet. This is where editing will come in. And if you want to avoid as much editing as possible, you can feel free to go, no, I appreciate that. Let's, you know, is there a particular person? In reality, it was a guy who was a parish councillor in Staffordshire. Went round to his house to interview him about something parish related. And as I was going, he told me this, I mean, this little white-haired white guy who ran a timber mill in Ghana and was made a chief of a local tribe. Just this incredible story coming out of this man. Brilliant. One of my favorite people. And I talk about him an awful lot because he was such a fascinating bloke. So that's the thing. And finally, fourth one, and then we'll have a quick break.
Yeah, finally, how did you come up with the name Monkey Pants Productions?
Well, the name of the company dates but well, the name of the company dates back to, well, it must be, the name of the company dates back again, you know, and it can be frustrating, and it depends how much editing you want to do. If you're going to be doing all of your own editing, that's fine. You just chop out the first 3 or 4 times they start with that phrase of the name dates back to. In essence, the name dates back to 2010. The BBC was switching from signing with sole traders, which I was. They needed to sign with registered companies. So I signed to a company, and everyone was going with, you know, Pete Morgan Productions or John Smith Productions, just using their name. And I didn't want that. I wanted a name that would stick. And this was a word that my niece came up with, and then my wife took on as kind of a nickname. It is apropos nothing. I really wish there was a more interesting story, but it was a word that we just plucked out, and here it is now. And we are indeed at Monkey Pants Productions. And those guests, that's why you plan an interview. And we'll talk more about some of the other tips regarding planning an interview. But I realise we've been going for just over a quarter of an hour. So we're going to have five minutes or so, 10 minutes or so. And then there'll be an awful lot to get through in the second half. So we'll be back in 5 or 10 minutes.
See you then. We're coming back to the chairs now.
Yeah, I'm just going to go through some of the questions. Someone mentioned about recording a drum that they did for meditation. It's very much a trial and error. It depends on the room that you're in. It depends what's in the room, depends the microphone that you're using. It's just kind of just trying it in different places and at different distances before you actually kind of get this, maybe the sound that you're looking for. And Lou, if we use copyright-free music or sound effects with no attribution required, do you think it's still best to mention the creator or the platform somewhere? I used to with copyright-free music. I would always thank them. Where's the best place to do it? I tend to do it at the end, like the credits of anything. Like when you hear on Radio 2 or Radio 4, they will say, you know, this has been a such and such production. My producer's been this person. You don't do it at the beginning, do it at the end, because it is just giving credit where credit's due, but it's not part of the entertainment. So you tend to put it at the end. M. Louise Kelly, you mentioned giving your podcast a good art. Can you expand on that a little? It's just knowing what am I going to do in this episode? I'm going to greet people. I'm going to explain what the episode is. I'm going to get into the meat of the episode, whether that's you talking by yourself or interviewing a guest. And then at the end, how are you going to end it? Are you just going to end with the end of the interview? Are you going to do a proper outro and say thanks very much to that guest? Is there a call to action for people? Is there social media that we can find you on? That's kind of what it means by an arc. What story is that episode going to tell? Mary English, absolutely right, Mary. You don't need music in a podcast, but you'll be surprised at how many people put on their favorite song. And just to let you know, if you think, oh, well, no one's going to listen to my podcast, I'll get away with putting, you know, my favorite song of all time on there. Apple and Spotify are getting very tough on people who are using unlicensed music that they haven't got the license for. And you could, with Apple, they've closed Apple accounts down. With Spotify, they just take your podcast off. Inserting clips into podcasts and how much you can use. Yeah, fair use, Daniel, doesn't exist. It's a kind of legal myth, and being married to a corporate lawyer, I know a lot about legal myths. Some people say, well, if you're not criticizing the music, you can use it. And there are some people that are absolutely getting away with it. But my advice is always, don't use music that you don't have permission to use. The BBC have come to an incredibly complicated agreement with podcast platforms to be able to put music in theirs. And you know, that took a long time to come to. I would just say, I just wouldn't use it. That would be my personal advice. Right. Can't stay for the second half. That's fine. Any advice about improving sound quality when interviewing more than one person? Currently, I'm to ideally, if you've got guests and you're using clean feed, yeah, and if you're sharing the same track as well, ideally, you make sure that mic technique is right. Are they the right distance? Are they in a quiet room? If they're in a very echoey room, a lot of people, for some reason, really like to record in their kitchen. And the kitchen's an incredibly sound bouncy room, a lot of plastered walls and things. Haven't done it before. I have a Mac, but it'll be live via StreamYard. Any advice you can give? Read quality. Absolutely. An external microphone. Don't use the microphone that's built into your Mac. Use an external one. Can you get a license from PRS to do music podcasts? Yes, you can, but it only applies to the UK. And there straight away is your difficulty. The global audiences now for podcasts are huge. North America has long been a huge audience for podcasting. A lot of mainland Europe, South Africa and Australia are really coming on board. So genuinely, Audio Jungle is a great one. There's another one that I use called Audio Nautics. There's a guy called Jason who's just composed these 200 pieces of music or so, and you can have a look through and you can use them. He asks for a donation, but he's never chasing copyright. He's not interested. You know, they're all his. He's written them and composed them, published them on this website. he's happy for you to use them. Okay. How do you get your podcast onto Spotify? I'm going to come to that. Here's a silly question. Does a podcast by definition have to include interviews? Not at all. The first podcast I did was about our dogs, and it was just me talking for 15, 20 minutes. One of the podcasts I do now, which is Podcast Pete's Podcast, which deals with different aspects of, is just me talking for however long the episode is. Okay, couple of interview tips. If you are interviewing someone, always have more questions than you need. Work on the assumption that the average answer takes about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So if you want 20 minutes out of the guest, don't have 20 questions. Always explain to the guest what you want to get out of the interview and the areas you're going to be covering. Don't give them the questions, because again, if they're in any way nervous, they'll write out the answers and you're just going to get read answers to your questions. Don't feel the need when you're recording to keep going, yeah, oh, during their answers, because on a podcast, that can become quite distracting. If you've got something to add to what they're saying, great. But those affirmations that work in conversation can distract the ear in a podcast. So imagine if you were listening to the Today program, for instance, and I know he doesn't do it anymore, but when John Humphreys was on, if he was constantly going, yeah, if you were having a conversation, it's fine, but listening back to it on a recording, it just distracts a bit. At the end of the recording, and remember, it is all recorded, so don't worry if you go on too long or if you stumble, it can all be taken out. Ask the guest at the end of the recording if there's anything they would like taken out. Because some people may say, yeah, actually, that bit where I, talked about me, kidnapping Vladimir Putin, I'd probably want that taken out. That's fine. Do not give your guest editorial approval of the interview. Don't say, right, I'll make it and then I'll send it to you. You can listen to it, because then that just becomes, and I know from experience, a real to and fro, and it can take a long time for that to give them the option at the end of the recording, and then that's it. So when you've got this and you've created this thing, and I see someone is asked an ideal length, Margaret's asking about ideal length, probably the most common question I get. I always say aim for about 20 minutes, but the caveat to that, and there are always caveats, some of my favorite podcasts are an hour and 15, an hour and 40. And some of my other favorite podcasts, the Washington Post do a great podcast called Retropod, which is daily, and it's about 7 minutes long. And it's just wonderful. So the best way to the best advice to give you is the length should be dictated by the content. If you've got a great guest and they talk and it's an hour, that's great. And if the next episode is just going to be you talking about an aspect of what you do, and that only ends up being 15 minutes, that's great. The beauty is you can change length. This isn't like TV where like a sitcom's got to be exactly 22 minutes if it's on ITV. It can be as long as you need it to be. So let the content dictate the length. Lorna, how long does the editing process tend to take in relation to the length? I tend to, initially, it's going to take you, I normally say 2.5 times the length of audio that you've got. And just a quick warning, and I can't unfortunately get into editing because it's a learned skill. It isn't something I can go do this, do this, do this. The first time you'll do it, you're going to hate it, and you're going to want to stomp about, maybe drink some gin, eat a lot of chocolate. It's just going to drive you mad. All I can tell you is it gets easier. The second time, the first episode of a podcast is always the hardest, because that's where all the setup has to happen. And then you learn stuff. So by about episode 4 or 5, you're into a groove and you're fine. When you've got this product, you need to get it out there. And this goes back to a question we had earlier on. So there's hosting and there's publishing. And the difference is hosting is where the audio lives. So there are podcast hosting sites such as Audioboom, Buzzsprout, Acast, Libsyn. And I've used Acast and Libsyn. Acast is very good, very user-friendly. Buzzsprout, if you're beginning for the very first time, I would look at Buzzsprout. It's incredibly intuitive, whereas Libsyn, a little bit more professional. There's a lot more forms that need to be filled in to make sure your podcast gets where it needs to be. And when it comes to publishing your podcast, that's where we talk about Apple or Spotify or Google. And different podcast hosting sites do different things. So like Libsyn doesn't put your podcast onto Apple. You have to do that yourself. Anchor does put your podcast on Apple, but you still need an Apple ID. You still need to have an Apple account. With Spotify, you don't. It's just a series of connections that you will go through using your hosting site. And Mark, thank you very much for agreeing with Buzzsprout, because it's incredibly good for beginners. Some friends of mine used it. I've used Acast, which is kind of intermediate, and the one I use for all of my clients is Libsyn, which, as I say, a lot of forms to be filled in, a lot of tabs and things you can click, and it's taken me, how long have I been doing this? 3 years to feel a bit more confident in using it. People also ask, should they go onto YouTube? Should they publish their podcast on YouTube? You should. YouTube is one of the top places that people find podcasts, but you don't need to film yourself. You can create a visual aspect of your podcast. If you've got a Mac, you can use iMovie. If you've got a PC, you can use Windows Movie Maker. You put the audio of the podcast on one track and you just put your podcast image on the visual track and stretch that out. So for 15, 20 minutes, however long your podcast is, it's just the image that's on screen. And because more and more people are taking up YouTube Premium, where you can lock your phone and still listen to the audio, people are using YouTube to find podcasts. So it's a good addition to have. It shouldn't be the only place. If you can only get on one, get on Apple. Still the biggest podcast publisher out there. There's about 1.5 million active podcasts on Apple now. Spotify's gaining ground. Google's recently entered the UK market. They've been active in the US for some time. And then there's YouTube, which I realize, and it's difficult because YouTube and Google are obviously kind of in the same melting pot, and they do use each other's statistics when saying how good they are. So getting on to those, Irene, SoundCloud, people do use SoundCloud. The reason I don't recommend SoundCloud, for a couple of reasons. One, SoundCloud nearly went out of business 2 years ago. And if they go out of business, that's it, your podcast is lost. They don't go, oh, well, we're out of business, but what we've done is we've passed your podcast off to another hosting site. That's it, it's just gone. And also SoundCloud they're more concentrating on DJs and musicians. They're not investing in podcasting. Can you shift from one another easily? Yeah, you can migrate from, if you're on Buzzsprout but you wanted to go to Libsyn, you can do that. Libsyn to Acast, you can do that. It's called migrating. You need to speak to both of the podcast providers to do that, and they kind of arrange it. They just need information. Faye, you've got a YouTube channel which I publish weekly. Should I do it as a podcast as well? Absolutely. It's a way of repurposing your content. The thing to be aware of, though, is if there's a lot of visual aspects to your YouTube stuff, listeners don't want to feel like they are second place in your thoughts. So it's fine to put your YouTube stuff out as a podcast, but if a lot of your episode is, and I'm sure you can see this on the screen, well, no, I can't because I'm listening to it. So just bear the listener in mind. Podbean is good. yeah, it's another. There's so many podcast hosting sites out there. Podbean is just one of the myriad ones that are out there. So marketing, Simon, thank you very much. If you're marketing your podcast, social media will be your best friend. You have to think about who is the person who I want to be listening to this podcast. And you will have heard this before, of your ideal listener. It's normally done as your ideal client. Your ideal listener. Who are they and where will they spend their time? Is it Facebook? Is it Twitter? Is it Instagram? Is it Snapchat? Is it Pinterest? Is it TikTok? Is it LinkedIn? Is it Reddit? Wherever it is, that's where your podcast needs to be as well. Ideally, I always suggest that your podcast has its own social media accounts, because if people like what you're doing, they start to look for it. Now, that'll be part of your intro or outro, is you say, you know, if you want to talk, if you want to find out more about us, you can, so let's say Anna's doing a podcast called I Love Knitting. You can either say, you can find me on the I Love Knitting Facebook page, or you can say, you can find me on my Anna Ganley Facebook page. All you have to do is make sure you're advertising it correctly. I would always ask that the podcast has its own social media accounts, because then your podcast listeners are not getting mixed up with your personal followers. And your friends don't feel like, oh, all right, yeah, you're plugging your podcast again. Big whoop. I've listened. It's fine. Let's move on. But that's where you need to be going to find your audience. When you post on social media, please, 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 please make sure you put a link to the podcast. Do not say, hey, I've got a great podcast out. Go to Apple and search for it. Because my response is no. Why? Because, and this is the thing, your friends and your network, they're going to listen to that podcast because they're your friends and because they're your network. They're not the people who are going to become your core audience. Your core audience are those people who've never met you, who live in South Africa, who found it on a podcast search and gone, yeah, I'm going to listen to this. Or found it on social media, yeah, I'm going to listen to this. If you tell me about your podcast on social media, you give me a link to either listen to it straight away, to take me to the website where I can listen to it straight away, or to take me to Apple or Spotify so I can listen to it straight away. You've got to cut down the number of clicks that people need to do from being told about your podcast to listening to your podcast. I've got it down to one click. So I have a thing called a direct download link, which I know Acast produced and Libsyn produced, and it's in my social media posts, and you click on that link and you're listening to the podcast. It's not a website, it's not a subscription page, it's the audio. So that's what you need to be thinking about with your social media, of bringing the number of clicks down. So I'm just looking at that's been answered. Do podcasts create a lot of feedback and questions? They can do. It depends what your material is, what your content is. And it's up to you if you want responses. You can tell people that, get in touch. I want to hear your ideas, or I want to hear. So again, I always use knitting as like the kind of go-to subject for podcasts. Some excellent knitting podcasts out there, by the way. If you want to tell me about your favorite pattern, or what makes a better knitting needle, wooden or plastic, then people are going to get in touch. If you're not interested in that, then don't invite it. But it's always wise to tell people how they can get in touch if they so wish, even if it's just to say, hey, I really like your podcast. Do you have any recommendations for visual to accompany things, says Catherine? Yeah, again, on the document that Anna's going to send out, Canva is a good site, which I'm sure many of you know about for creating images. But with things like Instagram, which is an incredibly visual medium, and also Pinterest, if you happen to be on there, you need to start thinking about using an image of yourself or using an image of something that ties in to the subject of that week's episode or that week's podcast. And the other thing I just want to say about marketing your podcast, don't, unless you've written a serial podcast, so a serial drama that's going to be performed and put out episode 1, and you've got to listen to it in order. If you're doing that, then this doesn't apply. But if you've done a podcast about knitting, and in episode 2, you're on, say, episode 43, and in episode 2, you did a piece on wool being made from alpacas, and then something, I don't know where I get this from, and then there's something in the news about alpaca wool, start talking about episode 2. Don't neglect your past episodes when it comes to marketing your podcast. Take every opportunity to tell people, oh yeah, well, of course, alpaca wool's in the news at the moment. You might have seen this article. Listen to this episode. We talk all about it. And so you've just tied it in with something. If it's World Knitting Day, then you talk about your podcast. If it's World Wool Day, if it's Hobby Day, or, you know, if it's a bank holiday, you know, you could start on a bank holiday, start knitting. Here's a podcast. Don't miss a chance to tell me about your podcast. And as I say, initially, it's going to be your friends and your network that are listening, and it's only on social media and getting on other podcasts. Get in touch with other podcasts that you like and you think, and say, I'm happy to come on as a guest. This is what I talk about. Reddit is an excellent social media platform. So on Reddit, they have things called subreddits, and subreddits are basically broken into categories. And there's a very good one called Podcast Guest Exchange. And you go on, I've got guests in the past, and you can go on there and go, hi, I'm an author. I write in this particular area. These are the kind of books that I write. Anybody want to have us as a guest? And most times you're going to get someone responding. Sorry, Mandy's saying, call me cynical, but I'm feeling this is just another time sink. Can it actually help a writer make a living? What it does, Mandy, in the same way that starting a website is never going to make you money, don't believe web designers who say, start a website and you can be earning thousands. A podcast doesn't make you money. What a podcast does, it enlarges your digital presence. It tells more people about you and what you do. And it's another way to tell the world what it is that you do. So I'm just reading, wait 1 second. Other than reading our work out loud, talking about research, any suggestions for content time? Yeah, absolutely. You can go through so many people or so many places are doing the top 50 books of the year. You can get together and discuss those, the pluses and the minuses. You can speak to other authors, talk about their process. You can maybe go through your process. And don't forget, the episode could just be 10 minutes long. I'm sure, you know, there's a lot of you that could actually break down your process into smaller chunks. And if you really wanted to, you could probably tell me in about half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, maybe an hour. You could detail what your process is. Well, you could break that down into 5-10 minute episodes. And there's going to be lots of other authors out there, or aspiring authors, who will be interested in that. First step, thinking about a podcast. I've done many BBC radio interviews at broadcasting, little television, sharing the same driver as those sad people you mentioned. Yes, they are. Anything I can take from that experience? Yeah, the big thing you can take from the experience, and this is a thing about microphones. So if we were in a room together, one of the ways that we would be communicating is by eye contact and by your facial expressions. When you meet a friend or you meet anyone and have a conversation over a table, it isn't just the words that are the communications, it's the non-verbal communications as well. The thing that people can get thrown by is when they don't get feedback. So they're not getting any feedback because they're just talking to a microphone, and the microphone doesn't let you know if what you're saying is interesting. And people can get thrown by that. But if you've done it into a microphone in a BBC radio studio, and all you've had is the presenter on the other side, you've taken a big step towards getting used to that. And that's why I say practice, because that practice will get you used. I've had 30 years of sitting in a soundproof room on my own and talking to nobody. And I've become quite adept at it now. So it is just practicing it. So at the moment, I'm looking into the camera. So it looks like I'm looking you in the eye. But if I want to look at, say, if I want to look Anna in the eye, I've got to look there. Well, now I'm not looking at you in the eye. Now I am. And it gets really confusing. So what I've tended to do, I'm just looking at the camera. I'm just trying to help you get that connection with me. Somebody mentioned mic brands. Yeah, that's going to be in the document that we'll send out. And I just want to talk about monetization. Don't start a podcast to make money, but there are ways of making money from being a podcaster. The first one is sponsorship. You are the sales team in the early days. You can get friends to maybe production cost, cover the production costs. If you want to take it bigger, and a lot of the hosting sites will put you in touch with potential sponsors, but you will need the numbers. And when we talk about numbers, we're talking big numbers. So a national sponsor will need to see, depending on the podcast hosting site, will need to see anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 downloads on a regular basis. That can't be a spike. That has to be the trend of your podcast. Now, the average number of downloads for a podcast is somewhere between 150 and 250. So you can imagine the degrees that you have to go up in to get to that level. So sometimes going to your friends and saying, listen, it costs me £50 an episode to make this. You give me £50, I'm going to give you a 30, 60-second ad at the beginning of my episode. You give me a script, I'll read it out. And then that's done. That sponsorship on a local level. On a national level, well, you're going to make some money out of it. And figures differ depending on the client, depending on the podcast hosting site, depending on any negotiation you get into. The other way to do it, which you may already heard of, is Patreon. An awful lot of podcasters are on Patreon, where you create a subscription model. So, and the subscription model is customized. You decide it. So, for instance, there's some that I know. You pay $3 a month, and you get the podcast a couple of days before everyone else, and then once a month. This is if it comes out weekly. Say, you get the podcast a couple of days before everybody else, and you get a bonus episode every month. For instance, $5 a month, you get all of that, plus you get an extra 5 minutes per episode, so you get slightly longer episodes. And then you know, if they wanted to pay $50 a month, and they don't have to pay it every month, month after month. If they just give you $50, they get the episode a bit early for that month and the bonus bit, and you can, put their name in the next thing that you write or whatever it is. It's completely up to you what it is, but those are the different levels. And there are some people, again, they're not making livings. There are no, well, I think Joe Rogan's probably a millionaire now from his podcast, but there are very, very, very few rich podcasters. It isn't about making money. It's about creating content. And then everything that comes from that is the benefit for it. Alicia, any thoughts on how, as a freelance journalist, I can use podcasts to raise my profile and ideally earn more? Most of my pieces are behind a paywall. absolutely. You can kind of almost, I mean, if you're speaking to a person, a guest that's come about from a paid job, there's nothing wrong with saying, can I speak to you another time for this other thing that I'm doing? And you talk about something else. What you don't do, obviously, you do not duplicate the story that you're writing for the publication you've been hired by. But if there's another aspect to that person, use that. And you can have your call to action at the end of your episode to say, if you want to see more of my work, you can go here, you can have a look. Yes, it's behind, it's behind a paywall, but you're pushing people towards what it is that you do. How does extra time per episode work? They would be uploaded separately to Patreon. They're not uploaded to Apple. It's a separate episode that's done to Patreon rather than anything to do with Apple or Spotify or Google. So it's all done through Patreon. Daniel, do the hosting sites need MP3? Yes. Only MP3s is your file size. The beautiful thing is, because the other thing you would need to consider, depending on the program that you use, this is a little bit technical, is kilobytes per second. So kilobytes per second, if you can find the setting in whatever you use, you want to go for about 128, because that brings the quality of the voice down. So the quality of the voice then is probably like a really good, not probably, it is like a really good FM radio signal. So you can hear it, it's clear, you can understand it, but it's not high definition audio. It's not CD quality, because obviously as soon as you start increasing the quality, you increase the file size. And there's so many podcast hosting sites that will charge you more for uploading larger files. So that's why you go with MP3, and that's why you try and keep your kilobytes per second to 128. Okay, I mean, I've run out. I mean, I hope you've enjoyed what it is. There's an awful lot to talk about. All the ways to get in touch are going to be in the email that Anna's going to send. And if nothing else, you can find us on social media. I'm at monkeypantsprod on Twitter. Let me know if you're starting a podcast. If nothing else, just because I'll share it and tell other people about it, because I'm subscribed to about 70 odd podcasts at the moment. And I'll tend to go through big binging sessions with them. At the moment, I'm tending to go for much lighter ones that really just make me smile, rather than anything too serious, because there's an awful lot that's serious in the world, and I'm just wanting to get the lighter side of things at the moment. So I can recommend. To be fair, I've mentioned most of them. No Such Thing as a Fish is very good. Radiolab is superb. There's an excellent one, an excellent episode of Radiolab called Juicevose, and it's about an autistic child that I sat in the car for 25 minutes listening to the end of it because it was so good. And in fact, I think it's been made into a film, and it's just incredible. So yeah.
Is it all the power of a good podcast?
Oh, just I mean, listen, all of you guys know the power of a story is incredible. True crime podcasts have taken off to the point that there were true crime conventions in America that were being held, and very well attended. If you've not heard it, Dirty John is an incredibly, you might have seen the TV show. The TV show has nothing on the podcast. The podcast tells a much better story than the TV show did. It is just, it's a really good true crime podcast. But yeah, Radiolab, No Such Thing as a Fish. Adam Buxton, as and when he does episodes, are all very, very good.
For those that have to leave us at 11:30, Pete, I'll do my wrapping up now. Are you okay to hang on for 5 minutes if anyone has any further questions?
Absolutely, yeah.
Box. I'll just do my wrapping up outro now, and then those that need to leave can leave, and we'll leave the chat box there for any final questions. Just to reiterate, we are recording this, so we will send the recording out with the follow-up guides so that you have all of the information in your inbox. And there's also a discount voucher for Pete's online course. So in case Pete has inspired you to take your podcast from planning to publishing, I shall put the link in the email and in the chat box in a moment so that you can follow up on that. Wow, that was a whistle-stop tour of the podcasting process. Thank you so much, and most importantly, for making us smile. We haven't smiled so much in quite a while. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, I'm glad.
You've made us all smile and laugh during this last 90 minutes. So, yeah, huge thanks for that in these dark times.
Yes,
so
I'm just going to post a link in the, because someone was asking about that Radiolab episode. So what I created. What I created was a Spotify playlist, and apologies if you haven't got Spotify, but it was a Spotify playlist. I've just put the link in the chat of amazing podcast episodes, and the Juice of Os episode is in there. He says, just checking that it is before I...
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions, because as a newbie to listening to podcasts, it's how to find the best podcasts and what podcast curation services, because I'm always looking for something good, and I spend half the time browsing rather than listening.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's so you can get incredibly overwhelmed, and I've said, I've even said that I don't think it's in there. So I'm gonna wait 1 second. I'm gonna find the episode.
Before we close the formal part of this session, I should just tell you a few things about the festival. We have a virtual Blackwell store, so if you do want to follow up on any books by our authors and speakers featured in the festival, if you click on the link, which I'll put in the chat box, a percentage will go to our contingency fund, so that every little helps there. Coming up later today in the festival, we have Is It My Job, which is about negotiating professional boundaries with translators. And we also have later this week, our afternoon tea has a Scottish flavour. So Ian Rankin will be in conversation with a former chair of the Society of Authors in Scotland, Merrin Glover. Both of these events you can sign up for on the events page of our website, which is societyofauthors.org/events. And you can catch up with all of the recordings on the Vimeo channel, which is just Vimeo, and search for Society of Authors and you'll find us. But yes, thank you so much, Pete. That has been
a real pleasure. Thank you for being so accommodating and coming up with some great questions. It's always and some new questions. Nobody's asked me how to record a meditation drum before, so that is my new question for the day.
Wonderful. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. If you do have some final questions, pop them into the chat box and we'll answer those. But yes, thank you for joining us, and well, you can join some more festival events before the 10th of December. So what have we got in the chat box?
Mary's asked, if someone you're interviewing is recorded locally, how do you edit it afterwards? I use Audacity and record on Skype, but if they're recording locally, is that what they should do to have better audio? Yeah, everyone recording at source, so recording locally, is always the preferred way of doing it. What they would then have to do is save their recording and send it to you. So they can send it. There's a great website called WeTransfer where you can send files of up to 2 gigabytes, and then you just download it, and then you get their quality file. You can have a Dropbox file, you can have a Google Drive file, an Amazon Drive file, just a shared drive website or program that you can use to get their audio to you, and that's the way to do that. The second Spotify clip I put in, that is the Juice of Os episode. It was incredible. So re-recording at source. My interviewer and I did a 1, 2, 3 clap simultaneously, which that's what I do. So my wife and I, we've started a new eating plan, and we decided to do a podcast about it called Healthy Not Hungry, and we just record them using these two, the ones that I showed you earlier on, and we just sit on the sofa on a Sunday night and we just talk. It's very much a journal thing more than anything else, because we're not medical professionals, obviously. And I do that. I get in between the two of them, and there's my clapperboard moment when I'm lining up the tracks a little bit later. Voiceover artists with home studios used to have a dedicated link, ISDN. Is that still the same, or are there apps now? Yeah, ISDN is still usable, Lynn, but there are new things. Zencaster, because you don't need, so ISDN was superb, very high quality audio. And if you've got the money to do that and install, but then you've got to rely on your guest having access to an ISDN link and machine as well. So that's why things like Zencaster or Zoom, and if both sides of a conversation on Zoom have got good microphones, it can sound pretty good. You know, it's not ideal. It's certainly not as good as being face to face, but that's out of the window at the moment. Any more, Fred?
I've put the final few links in there about the festival and further events, but I think, unless you can spot any more, Pete, I think that's
I don't
it.
think so. I think, but I'm really pleased. Thank you so much for kind of the questions you've come up with, and you know.
We've already had requests for more, so I think we'll watch the space for next year, part of our spring program.
Sorry, one just quick one. Irene, how did you get to do podcasts for hospitals? I do the Birmingham Children's Hospital podcast, which is effectively vocalizing their newsletter, and I did it because I worked with them and I knew the fundraising team. And when I was starting the business out, I just went to them and said, how about I do your newsletter as a podcast? And here we are nearly 4 years later, and I'm still doing it. So it's getting in touch with the fundraising team or the marketing team of the organization or the establishment you want to do the podcast for. Okay. Sorry, Anna, I keep cutting across you.
Well, I think we should go over to you for the final wrap up, because you're the pro. So I shall leave it with you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Are you on Instagram? Yeah, at monkeypantsprod. I will confess I don't do enough on Instagram. I need to do more. Twitter and LinkedIn are the two places that we exist. Just thank you very much for having us. Thank you for the questions. The big piece of advice I just want to give you when it comes to doing your own podcast, and I alluded to it earlier on, you absolutely should plan, but please don't procrastinate on it. Start podcasting. I have a good friend who spent 2 years planning his podcast, and he ended up doing 4 episodes. Learn as you go. The first episode I did it, my first podcast was called The Puppy Podcast. It's still out there on Apple and Spotify. And the first episode is just awful. It's just 15 minutes of me blathering on. And because I thought, I've spoken into a microphone for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. It turns out I didn't. And it's just awful. But I learned with every single episode that I did something new about being a podcaster. So just get started and then learn as you go. The first episode is never going to be perfect, so don't aim for it.
Okay, and with that, thank you all. Good luck with your podcasts, everybody.
Yes.
Keep us posted so that we can flag them. And yes, good luck. Have a great day, everyone, and see you the next. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.